Plants can respond to mechanical stimulation in several ways. What we've been talking about so far, plant movements, is what's termed thigmonastic responses. Thigmo is the Greek word for touch. Nastic is movement. So these are movements in relation to touch, and these movements are always in one direction, in the same direction. Now we're going to go into another plant response to touch, which is called Thigmomorphogenesis, which is a permanent change in the structure of a plant in response to mechanical stimulation. This was originally described in the 1960s, just quite by chance. A scientist by the name of Frank Salisbury, who was working at Colorado State University, was studying cocklebur. This is the same weed that gives those awful burrs that get stuck in our socks and shoes when we're hiking. He was interested in the growth processes of this weed, and he and his scientists would go out into the fields and daily measure a particular leaf on a plant. They'd go out, take a ruler, touch it, hold a ruler to the leaf, and measure the size of the leaf over time. But what they noticed, quite surprisingly, was that the leaves that they were measuring were always shorter than the leaves on other parts of the exact same plant. Not only that, the measured leaves, as the experiment continued, often turned yellow and died. But other leaves on the same plant, ones that had never been measured, were green and flourished. Salisbury explained, in his own words, "We were confronted with the remarkable discovery that one can kill a cocklebur leaf simply by touching it for a few seconds each day." Now, Salisbury himself was not so interested in plants' responses to touch, so this type of research was left for other people to continue. And it wasn't only for another decade when a scientist named Mark Jaffe at Ohio State University recognized this thigmomorphogenesis. He actually coined the term as a general phenomena in plants, that plants can respond in their growth to being mechanically stimulated. Now, why should a plant care if you touch it? Now, it doesn't really care if I, Daniel Shamovitz, is touching the plant, but why should a plant care in general if it's being touched? So when are plants touched, or when are they physically stimulated? I think the most obvious answer is by the wind. Plants, branches, leaves are constantly stimulated by the wind. And if there are any hikers among you, you know that a plant, a tree on the top of a mountain, and the same species in a valley look vastly different. A tree on the top of a mountain will be stunted, short, a relatively thick trunk, few branches with even fewer leaves, whereas the same species of tree protected in a valley will be tall, majestic, with many branches and many leaves. What we're seeing here is a response, an adaptive response to the environment. When a tree is exposed to the wind, it responds by retarding its growth and making a thick trunk in order to protect itself. When it's not stimulated by being swayed, it can put its energy into growing tall. We get back to the same point which we've talked about several times. Plants are sessile organisms. They're rooted, they're unmoving. They can't escape their environment. And because they can't escape, they have to adapt biologically. They have to respond by changing their development. And we can see this change not only in trees out in nature, but also in our favorite model organism, Arabidopsis, in the lab. What you see here are two pots of Arabidopsis. They're exactly the same age. The only difference is that this one was left untreated, whereas this one was touched 3 times a day. The scientists came, waved the hand over at 3 different times during the day throughout its life cycle. You can see that the one that's untouched, similar to the tree in the valley, is tall. I don't know if you can call Arabidopsis majestic, but at least it's tall and flowering, finishing its life cycle. Whereas the one that was touched, as if it was in the wind on the top of a mountain, is short and stunted, and it's actually delayed in its development. It's going to take it longer to flower and to set seeds. So shaking stunts development also in Arabidopsis. While thigmomorphogenesis, the change in overall growth, takes many days for us to witness, the initial cellular response is actually quite rapid. In fact, Professor Janet Bram and her colleagues at Rice University have demonstrated that simply touching an Arabidopsis leaf results in a rapid change in the molecular genetic makeup of the plant. What Bram discovered was what we call touch genes, or what she called touch genes. Now, to further understand the importance of this discovery, I want to take you on a quick tour of how genes work in general. The DNA found in the nucleus of each cell that makes up the Arabidopsis plant contains about 25,000 genes. And this is the same DNA, the same 25,000 genes in each and every cell of the Arabidopsis plant. At the simplest level, each gene encodes for one protein. So while the DNA is the same in each cell, different cells, though, contain different proteins. For example, the cell in a leaf contains proteins that are different than the cells of a root. A leaf cell contains proteins that absorb light for photosynthesis, while the root cell contains proteins that help it absorb minerals from the soil. So how is it that each plant cell can have the same genes but different proteins? The reason is that various cell types contain different proteins is that different genes are active. Or more exactly, different genes are transcribed in each type of cell. So that while each cell has the same number of genes, the same genes are not transcribed in each cell. While some genes are transcribed in all cells, for example, like the genes that are necessary to make the cell membrane, most genes are transcribed in only specific subsets of cell types. So again, to repeat this, while each cell has the potential to turn on any of the 25,000 genes, in practice, only several thousand of these are active, making proteins in a particular cell type. Now we can complicate this even more, because while not only are there cell type specific proteins, there are also environmentally specific proteins. Many genes are controlled by the external environment. Some genes are transcribed only in blue light. Some genes are transcribed only in red light. Some genes are transcribed when it's cold. Some genes are transcribed under a heat spell. And some genes are transcribed after touch. These are the genes that are transcribed when the leaves are touched. And these are the genes that Bram identified and called them the touch genes, because these are the first genes that are turned on, the first genes that are transcribed following mechanical stimulation.